Good evening. Welcome to the George R. Brown Convention Center and to tonight's Flooding and Storm Surge Symposium. We're very grateful for your being here and for this excellent attendance for an event that we are very excited about. It is with pleasure that my colleague Dave Martin and I are here co-sponsoring this event, two-part symposium on flooding and storm surge for the city of Houston and the surrounding region. This is indeed a city and county collaborative, and we do think inclusively about our surrounding municipalities and our regional neighbors and collaborators. In that regard, I think it's also very clear that the Katy Prairie Conservancy and our upstream headwaters are also very critical to what we have going on with flooding, and we're going to speak tonight a little bit in detail about some measures that the city is taking for flooding mitigation. And we're also going to focus with I think the first half of the program, we're going to begin with a panel discussion on storm surge, which needs to be a priority not only for the city and the county, but also at the state level and we think for the federal government to consider in terms of protection and resiliency planning, as multiple lines of defense are part of our ongoing strategy and planning initiative. I'd like to extend sincere gratitude to the sponsors of this event, including the American Institute of Architects, local Houston chapter. In fact, the Urban Design Committee has been very pivotal in organizing this group, along with the City of Houston, the Mayor's Office of Special Events, Houston First, the Houston Association of Realtors has been generous in their support and interest in sponsorship, as well as the Port of Houston. I bring greetings from Chairman Janice Longoria, who is unable to be with us tonight, but sends her greetings, as well as many of our professional engineers represented by the American Council of Engineering Companies. I would like to recognize a number of elected officials who have joined us tonight, including our Mayor, Sylvester Turner, who is here with us, as well as Council members Carla Cisneros, representing District H for the City of Houston, along with Councilmember Jack Christie at large in position 5. We're joined by Mayor Michelle Bechtel from the City of Morgan's Point. Michelle, thank you for being here, as well as former Councilmember Peter Brown. Peter, thank you for being here. We have staff representing Councilmember Amanda Edwards. We have some of Judge Ed Emmett's team. Judge was planning to be here for our January event, but is out of town today. We have staff for Controller Chris Brown, Congressman Ted Poe, Congressman John Culberson, Congressman Brian Babin, and State Representative Alma Allen. With all of this, I would like to thank my colleague Dave Martin from District E and ask him to add to my remarks.
Thank you, David. Just to let everybody know, I am totally responsible for today's weather. David Robinson was responsible for weather that we had last time that we had to cancel the flooding symposium due to a flood. So it's an honor to be here tonight. So I get the privilege of introducing our mayor, Sylvester Turner, mayor of the city of Houston. Now I can sit up here tonight and tell you about the young man who grew up in Acres Home and still resides in Acres Home, the gentleman who graduated from the University of Houston and went to Harvard Law School. But I'm going to tell you about the Sylvester Turner that I've come to know and love. He has many strengths and he has many weaknesses. He's done a great job with filling the potholes, balancing the budgets, and a tremendous job with the pension reform that is passed out of the House today to committee. Thank you. 6-1. Passed out of the Senate 7-1. Some of his assets are he's an extremely smart man. He is laser focused. When he tells you a yes, take it to the bank, it's a yes. When he tells you a no, get out of his way. And one of the things that he has, and I'll maybe a little bit touchy subject, but I'll talk about some of his weaknesses. And one of his key weaknesses, if he ever looks at you with his reading glasses like this, and he puts them on the bridge of his nose, run to the hills because you're in big trouble. He thinks he can dance and sing, and I tell you, he's not a bad dancer, but he sure as hell can't sing. And he may be, just may be, no offense to the other African Americans in the room, the most unathletic African American gentleman I've ever met in my life. But he's a great man. He's a man of high ethics, high morals, and high standards, and he is really doing a tremendous job for us in the city of Houston. So it's an honor and a privilege to introduce to you the mayor of the city of Houston, Mayor Sylvester Turner.
Let me thank Councilmember Dave Martin for those gracious comments. Gracious. And let me thank Councilmember Dave Robinson, both of them for giving leadership to this effort. Now, for my first song, I shall sing for you. I do want to thank these two gentlemen for taking the leadership on this, for what we're talking about tonight. And I know the first time it was planned, the weather, we got rained out. And so tonight, the weather is just great. And I want to thank Dave for making this weather possible. And then, of course, we've got other council members that they mentioned, Councilmember Cisneros, Councilmember Jack Christie. Good to see them here. I think there's another mayor here as well. I think I got the best city council in the whole United States of America. I'm just honored to have them. Yeah, give it a try. So I really appreciate their efforts. And then certainly to all of the other elected officials here, to those who are representing their elected officials who may be in D.C. I know we have representatives from Congressman John Culverson's office, and there are others, the entire congressional delegation. To those at the state level, a number of people who would love to be here that are in Austin, Texas. I know Dave Martin mentioned State Representative Alma Allen. I see one of her staffers that's out here. Then Steve Costello is here, the flooding czar for the city of Houston, just a number of individuals who are here. Let me put these glasses on. I'm not mad with anybody. But let me just say again to both of the council members, Martin and Robinson, to the American Institute of Architects, Houston, for putting on this important symposium, and for us, and for not just for City of Houston, but the entire coastal region. This is an important subject matter. Also, a special thanks to the event sponsors, the Port of Houston, Houston First, the American Council of Engineering Companies of Houston, and the Houston Association of Realtors. A special thanks to all of you. As everyone knows, 2015 and 2016 brought devastating floods to Houston, and we could go back year after year. You know, for those of us who come from this area, we know how we are prone to flood. I've made addressing flooding a top priority for this administration. It should be. To do anything less would just be irresponsible. So it's very important. People don't want to be flooding in their homes 2, 3, 7 times or more. In the first year, one of the best appointments I could have made was Steve Costello as the city's chief resilient officer, known as the flooding czar. Steve, let me thank you for giving leadership to this effort and doing an outstanding job. I appreciate you. Steve is coordinating efforts to come up with solutions to Houston's flooding challenges, and that's no small task, as all of you know. The city of Houston, through Steve's effort, of course, went to the Texas Water Development Board, borrowed $46 million to advance to Harris County to speed up the completion of Project Braves, which has been on the books for a number of years. Supposed to be completed in 21, then 22, but if you don't have the money, who knows when it was going to get done. And so at least the city is borrowing it, passing it over to the flood control district to bring certainty to it, to move that project forward. There are a couple of others that we've identified, White Oak, Huntington as well. Collectively, those 3 projects, about $130 million. And as they are approved, you know, hopefully we can do the same thing there as well. At the same time, under Steve's leadership, we started the Stormwater Action Team projects. This program is similar to my initiative dealing with potholes. There are several situations where the city can perform a fix to a localized drainage problem, which will help a neighborhood before a full-blown capital improvement project can be designed and constructed. But then addressing storm surge is another important focus of this administration and certainly of the entire region. I do want to acknowledge Councilman Martin, Councilman Robinson, in a meeting that we had last year with several mayors from the coastal region, state representative, well now state senator Larry Taylor, along with a number of others, talking about the storm surge and what needs to be done, where we all agreed to play a very active role in moving this whole initiative forward. I don't want Houston to end up like the East Coast after Sandy or New Orleans after Katrina. And I'm following with a great deal of interest the work being done by Rice University's, the Gulf Coast Community Protection and Recovery District, and Texas A&M Galveston. I look forward to a consensus being reached, and not too long ago I had the privilege of sitting down and talking with Senator Cornyn over this very exact initiative, as well as others. But I look forward to a consensus being reached so we can begin building a solution to protect our coastline. And that includes all of us, Houston, Galveston, the coastal communities. This is something that we all need to be standing together on, and it's going to take a lot of work to convince those on the federal level to join in with us. It's a costly venture, but it can be even more costly if we don't make it a priority for our region and if we don't aggressively pursue it, because we have been very fortunate and very, very blessed. It could have been disastrous with Hurricane Ike if it had just moved a little bit in another direction. So we've been blessed and we've been fortunate. But it also means that we need to be very wise and we need to act with some degree of urgency in order to move this project forward. And the City of Houston stands ready to work with everyone, with all of you, to see that that happens. So again, I want to thanks to all of you for the important work that you do to protect Houstonians and people in the region, not just the City of Houston. This is not just a Houston deal. This is a regional deal. It involves the counties. All of us are part of it. And I look forward to joining with you in a collective fashion to doing something major for our region and ultimately for the state of Texas and really for the country. Because what happens in the region, if the disaster should come, everybody in the United States of America will be affected at one level or another. So we need to work on it together. So thank you so very much, and thank you all for putting this on.
I wish I could be with you at this symposium. It's very important to our entire region. My thanks to the City of Houston, to Councilman David Robinson, Dave Martin for putting this event on. All the other participants, thank you for being here. As a member of the Gulf Coast Community Protection and Recovery District, clearly I support the Surge District and what it's doing, trying to figure out the best answer. How do we protect ourselves from storm surge? There's no easy answer, and then we're going to have to find the funding, and we've all got to work together on that. Since we live on the Gulf Coast of Texas, we know we're always going to be facing flooding, we're always going to be facing storms. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. The city and the county are working together right now on Brays Bayou. We'll be working together on the other watersheds just as soon as possible, but it's not something we win. It's an issue that we continue to deal with. So events like this are so critical because they produce ideas and they produce the momentum necessary to make sure that we continue to focus on these critical areas of flooding and storm surge protection.
So with that message from our mayor and that message from Judge Emmett, it is my pleasure now to introduce our moderator, Cambrell Marshall. He's the meteorologist with Channel 2 and NBC's affiliate. He's been 41 years a meteorologist, 18 of those years here in Houston, and he anchors and chairs Houston Newsmakers. I'd like to invite him, as well as speakers Solis, Mitchell, and Bedient to the panel, please.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you, council member. A couple of housekeeping notes. We are going to do this for about 30 minutes. We'll have a discussion. And it'd be a good idea if you would jot down your notes, questions you might have, because we will have about 15 minutes for questions to be asked from you, the audience. And I will tell you that while the 30 minutes that we have to have our conversation here, we hope to get in-depth responses and conversation going here. When we get to the question and answer part of this process, it may be more of a lightning round kind of things. We want to be able to answer your questions as best we can within the time that we have. Okay. First, before we get going, I want to have each one of the panelists say a couple of words about yourself, if you will, about who you are and what your focus is specifically professionally for this evening.
Sure. I'm Chris Solis. I work for Dannenbaum Engineering. I'm the Coastal Programs Coordinator. I'm also the project manager for the Gulf Coast Community Protection and Recovery District study, looking at coastal storm protection on the upper coast of Texas. Realize that our study looks at all 6 counties on the upper coast of Texas, and the Galveston, Harris, Chambers County region in and around Galveston Bay is just one component of the work that we are doing.
My name is Bob Mitchell. I'm president of the Bay Area Houston Economic Partnership. We are a 501c6 nonprofit organization, just celebrated our 40th year. We have 13 cities that fund the work that we do, as well as Harrison, Galveston County, Port of Houston, Houston Airport System. And we have taken this action on about 8.5 years ago. We think it's very important to protect not only the physical assets that we have, but the human assets that we have. And it's been a passion of mine, and thank you for being here tonight.
My name is Phil Bedient, professor at Rice University, also director of the Speed Center at Rice, which was formed in 2007. We've been in business basically since that time, working on storm surge and related issues in the Houston-Galveston area. I too have been at Rice for 41 years, looking at flooding problems and trying to work both within the bayous and now more recently within the coastal area. And I'm delighted to be here tonight.
Thank you all. And Phil, we do have that in common. 41 years, we ought to go have a drink, celebrate, huh?
That's exactly right. That's it.
Hey, all 3 of you are dealing with storm surge, and Mr. Mayor, you were quite right. We've been very fortunate in terms of what our environment has been over these last few years. We have dodged the bullet in many cases, and so the storm surge part is very important for us. Let's talk about the studies that you're doing. Certainly, all 3 of your groups are conducting studies, proposing various solutions to protect the Gulf Coast from storm surge. There's some similarities across the board and certainly some differences. Talk about them, if you will, about where you can find consensus on how to move forward, and talk about some of the differences and similarities among your studies you're doing. Start with you.
Oh, sure. So, contrary to popular belief, there's a lot of collaboration that happens between the 3 of us, and also with the, another great partner of ours, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we have some folks from the Corps here this evening. You talk about common interest. The common interest is it's research to determine what is the best system, okay, that provides regional coastal protection, that protects the assets, protects the people, and has minimal impacts to the environment. Whenever you build something significant, and some of the recommended plans that we're going to talk about this evening, you have to find that balance between the economics of the project, and you can't put a value on a human life, but you certainly do not want to destroy an estuary as significant as Galveston Bay, that's significant to the nation.
Okay, first of all, I'm not the expert on this. Dr. Bill Merrill, Texas A&M University, has done all the work on this. I've just been the person that's kind of got out in front and helped him push it forward. Like Chris just said, we have coalesced as a team around one solution, but I think what we need to look at it is it's not just one solution. To me, we need to look at it as a system. The most important piece of this system is the coastal spine. Without the coastal spine, the rest of it doesn't matter. We have to keep the surge out of the bay. So when we don't want to pick and choose. We look at it as a system, a step-by-step process, but the coastal spine that we all have coalesced around and Land Commissioner George P. Bush has coalesced around as well. That is where we need to go, and then look at how we stabilize the rest of the bay. Thank you.
From the Speed Center, we've been looking at it, this problem for a number of years as well. We also agree that the coastal spine is absolutely a necessity. You can't really protect this region, you can't really protect the Houston Ship Channel without some level of coastal spine protection all the way across. But in learning from the Dutch, there are also needs for multiple lines of defense. And that's one of the big pushes from the Speed Center. And in that regard, we have in-bay systems that go along with the coastal spine to add additional support and to add additional protection, especially for the Houston Ship Channel, which is sort of where we focused a lot of our attention, but not only for the Houston Ship Channel, also for the whole region, simply because Galveston Bay is such a large body of water and can be impacted by storm surge winds that come across. And so with respect to the coastal spine, we think that definitely needs to be there. We think there needs to be a ring dike levee around Galveston Island itself, and that's also part of the Gulf Coast plan, and in addition, mid-bay options as well.
Yeah. If you could flip to my slide real quick. When we talk about the go ahead, next one. That one. So what this slide shows you is that little inset that you see is Houston, the region today, the upper Texas coast today. And that's a storm in 2085, a 100-year event in 2085. And that's the amount of surge you're going to get throughout the region. Now, when you look at the next slide, or the larger blow-up, it shows you what we refer to as a coastal spine. That's the barrier system that goes along the coast of Galveston Island with a large navigation gate at Bolivar Roads across the ship channel. And you can see the reduction that occurs in the surge levels, is further up the ship channel, without protection, 21 to 25 feet, okay? With protection, you're bringing that down into the 12 to 13 foot level. And most of the docks along the ship channel are at 17 and 18 right now. So really, you're not even pushing water over the docks. You're protecting the industry that's there. And then if you look at the west side, there's still some inundation on the west side. And in our phase 4 of our study, we're looking at how we can potentially mitigate some of that flooding that occurs on the west side. So that gives you a perspective of with and without protection. The benefits on that. So if the cost of the system is somewhere, $11.5 billion, okay, that's our estimate, and that's for all 6 counties, okay. The return on that investment is more than 3 to 1, okay. If you look, and that's just direct damages avoided, okay. If you add the economic losses that are associated with a large storm event, people out of work, ExxonMobil no longer doing what it does, okay, your benefits jump from 3 to 1 to 5 to 1, okay? And it preserves somewhere around 115,000 jobs within the region, the state of Texas, and the country. So,
And how can you put a value on human loss?
you can't.
You can't.
No.
When you talk about these various options, I think it's pretty clear to know that there is going to be significant impact, negative impact for our community. What specific plan is there that will emerge, and how will that be paid for?
Well, again, I'm not the expert. I've got one to my right, but Dr. Bill Merrill and Chris are working on that. We have a lot of great ideas. I think we've got pieces of the puzzle that we've got already, but there's a lot of pieces of that puzzle that need to continue to work on. So to say that we have the answer to it today, we don't. We've got to continue to do these studies. We've got to continue to work together and piece this thing together like a puzzle.
We've been working in the Speed Center in that regard, looking at various ways to fund these projects, and these are very expensive projects. They're not hundreds of millions. They're in the range of probably a total of $8 to $10 billion, depending upon all of the different pieces that come together. And to fund something like that, obviously there has to be a federal involvement, but it may well be that there's also some local involvement, as has happened up in the areas like New York City and so on, to begin the process of beginning to do something. Here we are in 2017, the storm hit in 2008, and we really haven't done very much other than an awful lot of studies. A lot of studies and analyses have been done, and that's good. We're in a position now, I think we're beginning to coalesce on some ideas about the coastal spine and perhaps some other elements that go along with that. But to move forward in today's economy and in today's federal government sort of situation, it may be that we're going to have to get very clever about the way in which we fund these sorts of things. And that is definitely not me. I am not an expert in that regard.
So let me say something. Talk about the funding. George P. Bush has really taken charge of this thing and has put together a letter and has met with Dan Bland up in Washington, D.C., working directly for the president. We, last week, have officially been put on the infrastructure list that will go to the president and be approved. Where the actual item number is number 38. It's not based on the fact that we're number 38 in line. It's based on the amount of money that has been submitted and requested. It's $6 billion. So we're making a lot of progress on that, and we got to thank George P. Bush for that. The other issue that Senator Taylor has tackled is how are we going to, in the future, maintain this? And he put legislation out today that changes the Gulf Coast Protection District. They would be the overseer of the funding that would come in, and also the future maintenance of that. So
Wait, let me correct that.
go ahead.
It's the Gulf Coast Waste Disposal District,
Right, there you
okay,
go.
which is already an existing entity in the Chambers, Harris, Galveston County area, who already has taxing and bonding authority. So you would not have to establish a new entity for this particular function. So,
And they've added
not the
three counties to that as well.
yeah. When you talk about the federal funding, so in my past life as district engineer in Galveston District, I worked very closely with all my local sponsors on federal funding. So this is a flood control project. Normal federal cost share, it's 65 fed, 35 non-federal sponsor, okay? Now, jump to New Orleans. So New Orleans, post-Katrina, got $14 billion, 100% fed, okay? So I think you can take that model, okay, and say, well, maybe we don't get 100% federal, but maybe there's a place to negotiate there. So reduce that maybe 10%, 25%. I mean, right now, on a $12 billion project, you're $3+ billion on a local share. And again, that's over time. It's not like we're going to ask, somebody's going to come in and say, write us a check today for $3 billion, but still it's a significant amount of money. Judge Eccles, who is, the president of our board, has worked very hard with Senator Taylor to help craft that language. That's going through the legislature right now. He continues to work with other federally elected officials to understand what the need is. Senator Cornyn's staff was in a couple weeks ago. We gave a very good briefing to all of them, and they understand what the need is. I will tell you the difference between where we're at today and where we're at, last summer is we have a plan now. Okay, there is a recommended plan that's out there. If something happens, it's something that we could flex to very quickly. Okay, and we didn't have that before.
Typically, when you have something like this, the public at large, which would probably need to be on board and helping to fund some of these things, typically they react. They don't really say, okay, we need this ahead of time. They'll wait until something happens. What's the biggest challenge you think in trying to make sure that people understand the necessity to get this done now when they're hearing mostly in the public arena about how the city's got all kind of financial problems? That's just the city. We're talking about the region. But how do you take what you're talking about as being positive solutions to solve something that could be a catastrophe and get out in front of that and have people ready to support it financially and politically?
I think the work that we've started and continue to do, and that is to make sure that the entire congressional delegation, not just the Texas delegation, understands the importance of this region. When you look at, we're the #1 export port in the United States. 27% of all the gas produced is produced here. 60% of the jet aviation fuel is produced here. 80% of the Department of Defense aviation fuel is produced here. 41 to 42% of all the specialty chemicals produced in the United States of America is produced here. This is not a Houston-Galveston issue. This is an issue that goes across the entire United States.
And I would argue that it's an issue for Texas too.
Right.
Because when you look at this six-county region generates 31% of the state's GDP, okay? So, imagine that being turned off, okay, because of a storm event. What's the impact that it has on the rest of the state? Okay.
Let me follow up on that, and I agree with everything that you all have said. The critical infrastructure here, the critical engine that drives Houston is the Houston Ship Channel and all of the industries associated with Galveston Bay. And while we have to protect that area for sure because of the huge economic damage and economic impact that would occur, I think there are projects here that are being proposed that will be able to protect both the Houston Ship Channel as well as all of these residential areas if they're implemented. However, if we sit idly by and wait for the next big storm to hit, as was spoken earlier this evening, the last thing we want to do is end up like another Sandy or another Katrina here in Houston. We're a smarter city than that, and I think we need it. The time is right to move forward on these projects.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the big pieces too is understanding that this isn't a plan that's being put together just by a bunch of engineers. Okay, this is a plan that you know, we work very closely with our environmental partners, environmental science professionals, to understand that any kind of system that we put in place has potential impacts, and we certainly do not want to affect the quality of life of Galveston Bay. Okay, not just for you know, the industry that depends on it, as well as the species that live there or depend on the quality of the bay. You know, we want to do it. We want to do this right.
We have a room full of people who certainly are interested in this in a specific way: architects, engineers, developers, planners. What can they do to help move this conversation forward to generate the kind of support and solutions you may need? There are a group of people who certainly have an ability to help do that.
Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can talk to your elected officials. You can work with Chris. You can work with Phil. You can work with the Bay Area Houston Economic Partnership. We meet once a month, every month at our office. We've got 25 to 30 people there, from engineers to environmentalists, you name it, mayors, that we sit there once a month and have been doing it for the last 7.5 years to discuss this project and how we're going to take those next steps. And we have had a number of engineering firms that now do attend those meetings. So there's opportunities out there, and all three of us can help you connect those dots.
Yeah. And I would say the biggest thing is to be a supporter for coastal protection. No matter what doesn't matter what it looks like, okay? I mean, we will continue to define what it looks like, but the need for coastal protection is important. Texas is a big state, okay? There's only 18 counties of all the counties in Texas that are along the coast, okay? So you got to ask yourself, is Texas a state with a coast, or is Texas a coastal state? Okay, and people don't realize this, but everybody sits out in Midland, okay, Permian Basin, and they pump all their oil, right? And they count their money, okay? But where does all their oil and money, where does all that go? It ends up at Houston, okay? It ends up on the coast, okay? So they have an interest in this too. And I don't think, sometimes I don't think they realize that, so.
My biggest fear in all this, and obviously we share the 41 years and all that. I've been watching this for a very long period of time, and it's been since 2008. And about once every 15 years, this area gets a big hit. And so we're about halfway into that zone right now. And so the fact that things are moving ahead legislatively, I think is very exciting. The fact that George P. Bush actually took the time to come down and meet with all three of these groups, I think was very impressive. I'm glad that we've got someone at the state. I'm certainly appreciative that the mayor is on board with supporting flood control and sort of surge mitigation here. So I think the political will is starting to take place. The studies are starting to come together, and I do think there's some coalition going on.
A lot of your research has dealt with multiple lines of defense in terms of what's going on. The Netherlands has that as well. Talk a little bit about how you think that would be implemented, how they could be implemented in this region.
I really do think that, and as I said in my opening statement, the coastal spine, it's an absolute necessity. We have no argument there. But we think it's a really large bay. If you look at what they did in the Netherlands, they actually put in a mid-bay component to protect Amsterdam. They put it in much later than the original coastal spine there. But they put in a mid-bay protection. And the neat thing about this mid-bay is it runs right along the Houston Ship Channel, and it could become part of, if you will, the expansion that might be taking place on the Houston Ship Channel. So you get enormous benefits of scale in terms of the economic and impact involved. It's just to protect the ship channel, and it's to protect the west side of Galveston Bay. That's our big concern. I think the coastal spine does a great deal to knock down the bulk of the surge coming in. There's no question about that. It's just that residual, that extra, and if we get that really big storm that nobody's prepared for, it's nice to have multiple lines of defense. We've got 2 gates going on. In case that first gate out there at Bolivar Road should fail for any reason whatsoever, you've got a backup gate to protect the area.
I'm an eternal optimist, forever anticipating the best possible outcome. With the political environment we're in right now, my eternal optimism is tarnished a little bit on the edges.
You think yours is?
Yeah, no. But my question to all of you gentlemen is, if you look ahead, let's say 5 years from now, based upon what you certainly are passionate about this, you have all the reasons that we should do this. Looking ahead 5 years, what do you think our successes, your successes will be as a result of what we're doing right now?
Yeah, I would define success as having a plan, okay, that we've built consensus around, that's authorized by Congress, okay, that's federally funded, and is under construction. You know, it doesn't matter what part starts first, it's just we got to get started. Because once you get the ball rolling, the momentum picks up after that. So.
I think I'm a little more optimistic. I think what we need to do is we need to drive home the fact that this is a major infrastructure project, not only for Texas, but for the entire United States. The economy that we provide to the entire United States, if we get hit, could cause a recession. I think we have the information and the knowledge to get ourselves up on that infrastructure list, and I think all of our elected officials need to help us do that. We need help doing that. So I personally think if we can do that, I'm thinking we're pushing dirt in 3.5 or 4 years. That's how optimistic I am. And I think we need to do that. We need to take on that task, and we need help to do it. And I think we can do it.
I'm optimistic as well. I think that things have happened within the last year or year and a half where I'm really encouraged by the steps going forward, and I truly think we have got to start doing something. We've got to start turning dirt. I don't disagree at all.
Yeah. And, you know, it's tied to funding. So, post-Katrina, the federal government gives the Corps of Engineers $14 billion all at once and says, go build hurricane protection in New Orleans, okay, and finish it in 4 years. And he did it because they had the money. They had it all up front. It wasn't piecemealed to them, $100 million a year, you know, You know, you gave, the Corps is a great organization when it comes to execution, okay? And they can execute and build projects and do great things for the nation, so.
What kind of feedback and support are you getting from the ship channel industries about this?
Yeah.
I can address that. It's been absolutely unbelievable. The East Harris County Manufacturers Association really stepped up about 1.5 years ago, and I can't thank them enough, and Mayor Michelle Bechtel came on board about the same time, and I can't thank them enough for the work that they've done. I mean, to me, the East Harris County Manufacturing Association helped us turn the corner. When you can get those industries and those companies saying, it's very important, we may have protected our asset, but we haven't protected the people. It doesn't do any good to have all those assets if the people that work there are flooded and can't get to work. So without them, I don't think we'd be where we are today. So I think we have a tremendous amount of support from industry. Texas Chemical Council has been very supportive. Hector Rivera has made this a top priority in the state legislature this year. So we have the industry on board. There's no doubt about that.
I would agree with that. We've had a number of meetings with the industrial sector, especially out with the Port of Houston, and we've seen nothing but very strong support out there.
Yeah, echo the same comments, you know, and what industry is concerned about is their people, okay? They have assets that are at risk, okay, but they really care about their people, and they understand that, you know, when it's post-event, they need their people back so they can get back online, okay? And if their people are, you know, scattered here, there, everywhere, and they don't have a place to live, then they can't come back online. So they're very focused on.
And it's not only the people, but it's also those 4,500 tanks that are out there, right, that a number of them are subject to surge impact. And I came back from Katrina and started the Speed Center after I saw what a single tank at Murphy Oil did to an entire community, and that's actually what sparked the beginnings of the Speed Center. And so I've always been concerned about that happening within the Houston Ship Channel area, and that's what we've got to be most cognizant of.
There's one other thing that we've left out so while we're talking about this. When you look at what New Orleans did when they built that levee system around New Orleans, their flood insurance went to basically zero. Basically zero. What would our flood insurance, and there's a lot of people in this room today have got the new flood insurance bills, and I can guarantee you they probably went up 2 to 3 times this time, and next year it'll go up 2 or 3 times more. With this coastal protection, we can rid ourselves of flood insurance, or get pretty close to it. How much does that save our citizenry?
You know, from a resiliency standpoint also, I mean, you know, Texas is, you know, we still experience, you know, sea level rise on the Texas coast, not as significant as other places in the nation, okay? But the spine, you know, helps add a additional level of resiliency to the region to counter some of this sea level rise that you're going to see in the future.
Hopefully some of you have had questions, and we have about 15 minutes. We want to do that and give you a chance to ask your questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll acknowledge you. Yes, sir. You raise first one up, stand up, speak very loudly, and if I can hear you, I'll repeat it.
My name is Anwar. I worked in New Orleans for 7 years. For the last 4 years, I've been working with Chris on the 6th company. One thing that I would like in this meeting, because this has been happening for the last 3-4 years, there were like different divisions that I like this, I like this. This is one meeting today, and I feel very good that there is a consensus building here. So that's a very positive thing. But my question to Dr. Billion is, when you saw the option, the interior bay, the one that your option has, I mean, if you are having water coming from the Galveston area, and if that system is there, shouldn't that backflow any water on the other side?
No, you're talking about the runoff problem? No, it's a large enough bay. We've looked at it pretty carefully. Minimal impact. We've got a huge bay that we've blocked off, but it's a very, very large lake. So you're not going to see very much buildup there. It's about 5 to 6 miles wide and about 20 miles long.
So you have some warning there?
Yes.
All right, I have some questions as well that some people had sent in. One question was, what happens to the coastal ecologies that have evolved as areas that periodically flood? I'm not somebody who's familiar with the ecology.
You start and then I'll follow.
Okay.
And then we'll make him,
No.
we'll make him chime in.
I'll just listen.
So coastal ecologies. Interesting question, because it all depends, I think, some of the impacts would depend on the alignment of the spine. And we've looked at different alignments on the spine. We've looked at alignments that go along the beach. We've looked at alignments that have, you know, elevated the highway, Highway 87, Highway 3005. And then we've looked at, you know, offsetting the spine from the highway. You know, we found that offsetting it from the spine, instead of raising the highway, actually reduces a little bit of cost, because when you raise the highway, you still have to have interior roads and different things like that that drive that cost a little bit. Phil's smiling because he disagrees with me on that, but that's okay. You know, so you start looking at, you know, coastal ecology. I mean, it's already a coast that erodes, okay? And, you know, there's not really nothing we can do today to stop the erosion, okay? A beach alignment has many pluses to it, okay? But it also has some long-term operations and maintenance exposure, okay? You know, Texas isn't as forward-thinking when it comes to beach nourishment as, say, New York, New Jersey, and Florida, okay? The question becomes, and it's really a policy question, is the state willing to step up and, you know, accept a long-term beach nourishment program? You know, that's a little bit beyond, you know, what we as engineers look at. We just identify the problems, and the policy questions get handled by others. So
we at the Speed Center have a fairly intensive effort ongoing right now for environmental studies on the impact of blockage across Bolivar roads and also in Bay, and we're looking very carefully at that right now. And the big issue is, for us, what's the impact of these projects going to be in Galveston Bay itself on a day-to-day basis. And so we're very carefully looking at that tidal exchange and the exchange of species and sort of the microbiology and the biology associated with those systems. We have a team assembled. We're funded to do that work. We're using a full three-dimensional computer model of Galveston Bay that was just created at the University of Texas. It's going to be one of the best approaches out there, and we plan to take a very careful look at that. I'm an environmental engineer first, and so I'm very interested in the results of that.
Yeah, so today we hosted a conference call between all the organizations, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Speed Center, GCC PRD, and Texas A&M University. We're all building models for the Galveston Bay, okay? We're all using relatively the same input data, okay? We're building different models based on our expertise with the models. You know, and some of you are saying, well, it sounds like the work's redundant. Well, actually, it's not, okay? Because what we're doing is we're building in a level of peer review, okay, and quality to show that says we've got 4 different models that report, you know, this data, and I believe when we're all said and done, the data is going to be consistent with each other to show that, you know, the structural alternatives that we do select and choose, you know, minimize impacts to the bay.
The important thing about what Chris is saying, though, is for the first time, we're actually interacting with each other, and we're having monthly phone calls, and we're sharing data, and I think that's a good thing.
Well, one of the questions as well has to do with some of the interactions and some of the collective thoughts. Among the flood protection and storm surge communities is the discussion of climate change and its impact taking place, and if so, what does that discussion sound like? One of the sharp minds.
I
I'll let you answer
No, I can say the answer is yes, they are looking at that. But again, these guys are the experts. They can go into a level of detail that I'm not unable to do. But the fact of the matter is, yes, that is a part of this.
Yeah, so what we look at from a climate change perspective is, you know, how do we quantify that from an engineering perspective? Okay, and we can do that by looking at the sea level rise. We've got great gauge data, okay, at Sabine Pass, at Pier 21 in Galveston, at Freeport Harbor. I mean, gauge data, Pier 21 gauge has been there for over 100 years. Yes, okay. So we know, based on the gauge data, you know, what's happening, what has happened over time with sea level rise. And then we have a model that we're able to plug that into, and the model gives us some predictive analysis of what will happen over the next 50 years, okay? And it gives you 3 different curves. It gives you a low curve, an intermediate curve, and a high curve.
And we're all working with that information.
Yeah, so, you know, the intermediate curve in 2035 shows about 9/10 of a foot. By 2085, potentially 2.4 feet, okay? Now, Mother Nature gets a vote, okay? It could be less, it could be more, okay? But those are numbers that we're working with for our study purposes.
One of the other questions from the audience, priorities help focus the efforts. Which part of the project gets built first?
Thanks for the really easy questions.
Yeah.
We appreciate that.
Go ahead, Phil.
I think the project that gets built first is the one that gets the funding first. If they can go and get the federal funding for the entire project, that's wonderful news.
Yeah. I would answer it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
The coastal spine will get built first. We have to stop the pre-surge going into the bay. We haven't talked about the pre-surge. We've just talked about the flooding. A big part of the damage that we had with Hurricane Ike was a pre-surge. It was such a massive storm pushing a massive body of water. If you remember, 24 hours before, there was probably a foot of water in the Galveston area. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. We have to stop that pre-surge. So it has to be, the funding has to go toward the coastal spine to start with. We've got to stop that pre-surge.
So I'll put on my federal OMB bureaucratic hat, okay? And I will tell you the project that gets funded first is the project that has the highest benefit to cost ratio. Because that's how the federal government sorts projects and allocates funding.
Is some part of that showing up as being the most likely that fits into that category in terms of the possible solutions that are out there?
I think our research has shown that these are very viable projects with the 3-to-1 BCR, you know, fundable projects. Mm-hmm. So,
I think it's really a function of trying to get the attention at the national level. Yeah. Because without that, we're really in trouble down here.
One of the other questions from the audience, cities such as Amsterdam have had decades, even centuries of learning how to allow flooding without damage occurring. These cities have recognized that it's financially, culturally, and ecologically beneficial to work with water. Can Houston find similar opportunities?
We've all been to the Netherlands. We've interacted extensively. We have
Multiple times.
Multiple times. We have an exchange program with Texas A&M Galveston that Rice is involved in, and there's a wonderful exchange with Netherlands. And the Dutch have done a fabulous job. However, they do not have to deal with 18 to 20 foot storm surges, and they don't have to deal with 18 to 20 inches of rain in 2 days. So they have a very, very different meteorology over there. And granted, much of the country is below sea level, and that's why they're so good at what they do. We rely on their expertise and their inputs all the time. But as I say, our situation here in Texas, as everything is with Texas, all the storms are bigger than almost anywhere else in the country. They really are.
And you know, I had a great conversation with a Dutch professor who was down here, and we were talking about the project and the cost of the project and comparing it to the Dutch program. And he said, what you have to understand, he said, you know, the program that we have, the Delta Works program that we have, it's a matter of national survival for us, okay? If we don't fund it, okay, the nation ceases to exist, okay? He said, that's why our tax rate is 51%, okay? I said,
Well, it's in the national fabric of the Dutch,
Right.
and maybe we can use that to start to get flood control and flood mitigation into the fabric here in Houston, both in terms of flooding as well as in terms of storm surge.
The other thing I'd add too is that, you know, the Dutch have figured it out. They've been doing this for 40 plus years, and they continue to improve on the system that they have. So again, it's not one solution, it's a system. You continue to learn from Mother Nature. So we'll never have the perfect solution, especially starting off.
One of the questions from the audience is, it's a needed project. How much have we spent in terms of the different groups that you represent? I'm curious about ballpark figures about how much has been spent on this process already.
well, you know, our GCC PRD, our budget's, you know, public knowledge. We had, phase one was $3.9 million. Now we're into the next phase, and GLO funded us another $3.1 million, so, you know, do the math, a little short of 7.
I would add that Ferdell Rosen's here tonight, and I want to thank Ferdell for all her work. The money that Texas A&M has received to date to do these studies have come from volunteers, have come from individuals, they've come from small cities. There's been no federal money given. This money has been raised by a group led by Ferdell Rosen to fund these projects. So it's been about $2.1 million.
And over the years, we've been graciously funded by the Houston Endowment for 3 different projects, including the one going forward, the environmental study. And all total, it's in the range of $6 to $7 million.
Yeah, just let me
since about 2007.
Just let me clarify, the funding that we got was actually, it comes from the GLO, but it's HUD, CDBG money, Community Development Block Grant money for planning. And it was part of the money that GLO received post-Ike. Okay, so.
Question from the audience as well. Dikes and levees, are they the only alternatives? And what kind of other planning is involved? When you were talking about pre-surge, that sort of thing. The question is, what other kind of planning is involved?
I'll talk about it in general. These guys are the experts, but in general, this is not going to be a brick wall. If you look what the Dutch have done, there's revetments, and they cover them with sand and sand dunes. And basically what they've done is they've doubled their amount of recreational area that they have along their coastline through this storm surge system. So from a technical standpoint, I can't answer that, but from just the system itself, it is not going to be ugly. It's not going to be concrete. It's going to be aesthetically pleasing to the eye, and again, recreational areas.
With respect to the mid-bay, and there's a handout out there at the table that clearly shows, we've been working with some of the top architectural firms in the country, and they've laid out a hiking trail and a biking trail and back areas for boats to park and all of that, all along the mid-bay. And so it becomes a major potential recreational park, literally. So yeah, the opportunities for doing that, I think, abound in the region, especially on anything like the Ike Dike down along either the coast or even associated with the highway. You can do a lot to make that really blend in with the community.
Yeah, you know, and so, you know, our website, www.gccprd.com, you know.
Do you expect someone to remember that?
It's a you know, unsolicited plug, but anyhow, the Phase 1 report lays out all the different alternative structural solutions that are out there. We talk about levees, okay? The reason why we look at levees, okay, levees are cheap, okay? To push earth and compact earth is a lot less expensive than building T-wall, okay? You know, our cost on T-wall in the report was, depending on how high it is, as much as $16,000 a linear foot, okay? And that's for a height of 10 to 12 feet, okay? Very expensive, where you can move a lot of dirt a lot less. And when you start talking about benefits to cost, okay, you want to drive your costs down so your benefits are up, then your BCR is higher, and the feds say, that's great, we're going to give you money. So,
So that was GCCPRD.com. Okay.
Wow.
That's pretty good. So I apologized earlier because I was telling you could stand up and ask questions, but then again, I already told you to write your questions down on the card. So thank you for writing your questions down. I want to thank the panelists for being here tonight and starting this conversation, letting everyone know what is at stake, what is being done, and what more all of the audience can do as well. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. We're going to thank you. Give them a big round of applause.
you guys.
We're going to take a little bit of a break, 5-10 minutes, and get ready for the flooding panel in just a moment, so don't go too far. We'll be back in just a minute.
Okay, everybody, take your seats. Two quick pieces of information for everyone. All questions that we received in writing and the answers to such questions will be published on AIAHouston.org. Once again, all the questions that we received tonight and the answers will be published on AIAHouston.org. Also, there was a question that Bob Mitchell answered about what will the coastal protection, the Ike Dike, look like? My dear architect friend David Robinson pointed me to this magazine. It's called Texas Architecture. And within there, they had a great article for us non-architect folks called Protection in Place, which gives some conceptuals and some graphics as to coastal protection system and what they look like in other areas. So if anyone's interested in this magazine, you can find it at TXAMAGAZINE, TXAmagazine.org. And it's, once again, the Texas Architecture Magazine. So, Cambrell, the show is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Joining me now are Steve Costello, the Chief Resiliency Officer of the City of Houston, Marianne Piacentini, the Executive Director, Katy Prairie Conservancy, I love saying her name, and Russ Poppy, who is Executive Director of the Harris County Flood Control District. Thank you all for being here. And as I did with the first panel, just take a moment and talk about what you do in your role with the city and your role with Katy Prairie and Harris County Flood.
Well, most people don't really know what I do. They're trying to figure out what the resilient officer really does. So I remember when the mayor asked me to join his staff, he started laughing and said, "I'm going to call you the flood czar." And I said to the mayor, "Mayor, don't call me the flood czar. It's kind of embarrassing." So he makes the announcement of the Great Houston Partnership, and lo and behold, the next day, someone notices me running up Memorial Park and says, "Hey, that's the flood czar." And yet I was a city council member for 6 years, ran for mayor, and nobody even recognized me. So it's all about your job title. But really what I'm doing for the mayor is basically focusing on flooding and drainage issues, working with our sister organizations, trying to find money for some of the problems that we have. And what most people don't know is a lot of the problems we have are not even related to riverine flooding. They're just due to inadequate infrastructure. So those are the things I'm working on right now.
I'm Mary Ann Piacentini. I'm the Executive Director of the Katy Prairie Conservancy. We're a nonprofit land trust. We've already protected 20,000 acres on Houston's west side for the benefit of people and wildlife. My interest in this is that many people think that the Katy Prairie is one part of a solution to flood mitigation in this region. And I'm interested in nature-based and natural systems that can work in concert, in conjunction, or instead of gray infrastructure, because I believe that they are more cost-efficient, they're more resilient, and they can last forever without lots of maintenance costs.
Good evening. My name is Russ Poppy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harris County Flood Control District. And the Flood Control District is a special district of the state. We were actually created by the Texas legislature back in 1937 after some severe floods devastated downtown Houston. They established Harris County Commissioners Court as our board of directors, so we don't report to the state, we report to local government, which I think is a good thing. And our jurisdiction is essentially the entire Harris County limit, which is around 1,800 square miles. Within that 1,800 square miles, there's around 2,500 channel miles, several hundred stormwater detention basins, and our primary goal and objective is to address flood risk in our region as it relates to those open channels, waterways, and streams, and open air detention basins.
So, as the last time, the same thing is true if you have questions. We have cards that you should have had. I want you to write those cards down, and when we get to the end of our 30-minute session, we'll be able to ask those cards as I get them passed up here to the front, and we'll take care of that. First question goes to you, Steve and Russ. Certainly, for those people who are dealing with flooding issues of any sort, we can't get it squared away fast enough. What kinds of things are the city and Harris County doing right now, working together, collaborating on in terms of projects that can help to keep flooding from happening, or at least keeping them from happening as bad?
Well, I think most people don't realize how much of a working relationship we actually have that was never really defined. And so when I first joined the mayor's staff, I went to flood control and said, is there a way that we can help you do some of your job and help in your mission? And I'll let Russ talk a little bit about that. But we collaborate now in terms of helping to fund some of their projects. We collaborate now in planning, which we've never done before very well. On a quarterly basis, both planning groups get together to talk about, well, this is what we're planning on. Are you doing any work in those areas? We're collaborating on regional detention facilities right now, where we bought a site over in Inwood Forest, and they're actually going to build it for us, and we'll share the storage. So there's a lot of things that both agencies actually work well together with. But we're trying to change the image, get out to the public, and tell them that we actually are working together.
Yeah, Steve mentioned a lot of the capital approaches that we're taking together collectively, but just as important, and I don't want this to take a back seat, is the maintenance of the infrastructure. Just recently, we had meetings both with the city members of Public Works as well as my staff to look at infrastructure that needs to get addressed. There were some ditches that needed to get desilted, that needs to get selective clearing done, and we're working very closely to get both agencies out there in some instances together to address those issues.
You both mentioned infrastructure in some way, shape, or form. What rises to the top in terms of one of the highest concerns that you have in terms of what infrastructure really needs to be focused on first and foremost?
Well, whenever we're talking, Russ and I talk a lot to communities collectively, just like we're doing here tonight. And what we remind the individual homeowner is that we have separate duties. The city is the drainage entity that brings rainwater from the rooftop to the bayou, and then the district accepts that bayou flow and then takes it down to the bay. And we try to do that conveyance collectively without impacting properties along the way. However, when you're someone who's had water in the house, they don't really care about the distinction between two agencies. They want everybody working together to make sure water stays out of their house. And so that's what we have to do now, and our mission is to make sure that we are trying to achieve that mission.
Is there a certain kind of infrastructure that you are most concerned about, Russ?
Right, and Steve mentioned jurisdiction. It's an important distinction. Our primary focus is the open channel systems. So as the raindrop hits people's gutters, goes down the streets, collects in the storm sewers, that's not us. but it's an important piece of the puzzle because that raindrop has to work its way down to our channels, which is why it's so important that we work together with Steve and the 33 other municipalities that are within Harris County as well. So it's very important that we work together collectively, but really our jurisdiction kicks over when it gets into the big stormwater detention basins as well as the open channel systems.
Yeah, so as a city, I mean, we need the outfall. That's really what it's driving. And it drives whatever improvements we're doing to convey the water to the outfall. But what Russ brought up before, I don't think everyone really took handle of that. We're now looking at a division of labor relative to some of our maintenance facilities. Russ and I are talking about possibility coming up with a plan where flood control takes over all open ditch systems and the city take over all enclosed systems. And if you think about it, that's really what our primary missions are. We do storm sewer rehab and rehabilitation. Why shouldn't we do that? And they do open ditch. That's what they do for a living. So we're actually rethinking how we deliver this drainage and flood protection model to the city.
Mary Ann, I want to talk with you for a second. A lot of the cities that have dealt with flooding over the decades have learned how to deal with the flood waters that may come and go. Talk about how the Katy Prairie plays a role in the flooding issues that we have. How does it play a role to help actually keep our areas from flooding, and how do you see that continuing to play an even bigger role going forward?
Well, interestingly enough, part of the reason that the Katy Prairie was so important to flood control was the levee system that was there because of all the rice farming. Farmers put water where they wanted to put it. And now that the levees are being destroyed or taken down for development, water's going in places that it never went before. It's one thing. Secondly, though, prairie grasses absorb water. So if we can restore some of those prairies that were there before from agriculture, from pasture land, back to high-functioning prairies, they're going to hold more water. There's a study that was done in Missouri, and a companion study was done here by Flood Control District to look at how much absorption can there be from different kinds of land uses. And when they looked at prairies, they're holding 6 to 8 inches of water over a 24-hour period. Missouri restored some prairies from cropland to prairie, and they were holding that 8 inches. That means that those 8 inches aren't going into your channels and your rivers. There's also a wonderful example in Yuba County, California, where their aging infrastructure of their levees were damaged by a flood that cost them about $300 million. And instead of putting the levees back where they were, they moved the levees back to allow the rivers, the creeks, and the bayous room to go where they wanted to go. And rivers do tend to, when they're not either channelized or boxed in, to go where they want to go. So one, we have a lot of land that we can hold water on, and during the tax day floods, we actually held 6 feet of water on most of our 20,000 acres, and it was there for 4 to 5 days. Now, did it stop flooding? No, but it's a piece of the effort. It's a part of the tool in the toolbox that if we had a multi-jurisdictional system, if we had a system where we were all working together, would be something that would be helpful.
Russ, talk about there's something called the Plan 5, which is Cypress Creek Overflow Plan. It kind of sounds like it's something that kind of ties into what you're talking about. What is that about?
I think before we start talking about the plan, we have to talk about why we even started looking at it in the first place. And there's really a natural phenomenon that we refer to as the Cypress Creek Overflow. And this overflow is a natural phenomenon that has been no secret to our area. The Corps, in fact, knew about it since the 1930s when they started looking at planning for and building Addicks and Barker reservoirs. And basically, essentially what happens is when Upper Cypress Creek gets around 6 to 7 inches of rain, water not only leaves Cypress Creek top of bank, it actually leaves the Cypress Creek watershed. And it does so in a manner that it encompasses several thousand acres to anywhere from several inches to several feet deep. And the main, I guess, challenge in trying to figure out a way to manage that is that it doesn't happen in any given conveyance area. It's not being contained by a channel. This is literally, if you've ever seen footage from a helicopter after one of these events, I mean, it's literally thousands of acres of water, as I mentioned, several feet deep, and it's moving water. And so there's no real defined channel out there. And so what Plan 5 did is, it was a study that was co-funded by the Water Development Board as well as our organization that looked at a suite of options that would basically attempt to contain this overflow before it started happening and put it in a system such that it can be managed and handled in a gravity function downstream. And so essentially what you're looking at in Plan 5 is another mini reservoir, not unlike Addicks and Barker. It would be an earthen dam. It would be about 8 feet high at its highest location, and it would slope back down into natural ground. It would cover around 11,000 acres and hold around 26,000 acre feet of water. And 1 acre foot of water is basically the amount of water it takes to cover 1 acre of land to a depth of 1 foot. So a very large amount of water could be stored there. And what this would do, if constructed, would essentially remove that overflow from happening over around 18,000 acres. Now, that doesn't solve all the riverine flooding that still exists and is associated with those channel systems, but what it does do is it addresses the overflow issue, which is a very complex issue for development as well as regional mobility to accommodate. And so that's essentially what Plan 5 does, but I do want to point out there's an important distinction between this reservoir and Addicks and Barker. Addicks and Barker have gated outlet structures, meaning that the Corps of Engineers can make the decision whether or not to open and close those gates. The beauty about Plan 5 is it was designed to operate without a gate. In other words, it would be specialized outfall structures designed to operate depending upon the level of water inside the reservoir, but it would all drain by gravity and without having human intervention to operate gates. And it would slowly release water back into the Addicks Creek watershed as well as into Cypress Creek.
I hear that, and it sounds great. But I also heard the mayor say earlier about the city borrowing money to put into to trade off to make sure that a lot of the infrastructure issues, the bayous and things like that, that were behind as far as the federal funding was concerned, that was changed around so that it could be sped up a bit. So this Plan 5 thing, that would not theoretically get in front of anything that's already, because right now when we talk about plans that are happening with Harris County flood control, it seems way off in the distance. And you were talking about people don't like water in their homes, and so that's what I'm thinking of right now.
Sure, Plan 5 in our estimates as it stands right now would be about a $370 to $380 million project. And that's on par with our other federal projects such as Braze, Sims, Greens Bayou. So for sure, I think this is a project that we would certainly be looking for federal support. And in fact, we've had conversations and continue to have conversations with the Corps of Engineers at the Galveston District to look at what we're calling a 216 study, which essentially would look at the operations of both Addicks and Barker Reservoir in conjunction with this potential reservoir and see if that would help address and allow the Corps additional efficiencies and opportunities to better manage the release rates on Addicks and Barker Reservoir.
How would that affect the Katy Conservancy?
I want to add one thing before I talk about how it would affect us. I think one of the beauties of the Cypress Creek Overflow Committee was that there were a group of people trying to work, just as you had the panel before, on consensus, but there were environmental groups, there were developers, there were public officials, and we looked at 12 different scenarios that were potentially could solve this problem or at least help reduce flooding. We're not going to eliminate it. That's not what any of us expect it to do, but it could significantly alter the flow of water and slow it down. And so it really took, though, the Tax Day flood and the Memorial Day flood in 2016 to make people realize that water is going in new places that they've never seen it before. And there is an urgency to some of this. But what I'd like to suggest is that people begin to think that, some places get flooded repeatedly, some places seem to never get flooded, but it is a regional-wide problem and one that we all need to think about. And so in terms of flooding, while I do think we need to go to the federal government, and I do think that there are going to be things like, I hope, impact fees that people who are able to develop in one place and not and save another place will help put into it. I also think that sooner or later, the public at large has got to decide how important is eliminating flooding to the extent that they can do so. And are they willing to tax themselves for it? Are they willing to do a ballot initiative, whatever it takes? Because one of the beauties of what this Plan 5 does and what other parts of the county could do that are similar to this project, although they probably have their own unique set of conditions and issues, is that it's it's multifaceted. It doesn't just reduce flooding. It also provides incredible wildlife habitat. It provides recreational opportunities for people. Wetlands are nature's kidneys. They reduce pollutant and sediment offloads. It can improve air quality with carbon sequestration. So for the Conservancy, what it does is it immediately adds 5,000 to 6,000 acres of land adjacent to our own preserve system, which the more land we save, the more water we can hold. And the more land we save, the more we can restore to tall grass prairie and get that uplift that's absolutely critical to hold more water. Because it's not just that they help with transevaporation, it's also that most prairies have 12 to 18 feet of root structure below ground. In addition, though, to saving the Katy Prairie, I would also urge that, when Russ and I were just talking about this last Friday, we're also looking at, is there a system to actually change the landscaping of this region that would go away from things that need fertilizer, that need lots of water, that are, draining right into Galveston Bay, and using native vegetation that still looks good, it doesn't grow 12 feet so that, homeowners associations hate it, but that actually could provide another benefit also to do what Steve and I talked about a while now ago, and that is maybe hold at least the first inch of rainfall on your own lot. And I know that because I have a gigantic house next to me that just floods my backyard, and if they were even holding 1 inch of rainfall, it wouldn't happen. So those are some of the things.
So, Cambrell, before we go to the next question, I was sitting and listening to the panel before us, and so I've got a lot of people here. And so I want to put a little bug in your ear. One of the reasons why the city got involved in the federal project that the county is building is because our residents were complaining about the lack of progress. Not because of the validity of the job or what flood control was doing, but because of lack of progress, which had to do with funding. If you think about what they just described to us and the threat to our region was only $11 billion. If we were able to raise 1 penny sales tax from Houston to Galveston alone, we would raise $900 million in 1 year. We could actually get, if we could get the state legislature to give us the permission to ask the voters, would they be willing to raise a 1 penny sales tax revenue for 10 years, we could pay for it ourselves and not wait for the federal government. That's what this is all about. What I learned when I came to Texas in 1977 was this is a can-do city and a can-do state. And so it's now time for us to stop being reactive and have a Sandy or an Ike. It's time for us to, or Katrina, it's time for us to be proactive.
One of the things you talked about was, we talk about the money, the Rebuild Houston program. A lot of the people were thinking that that's what that was for, that they were paying into something to help kind of mitigate and keep some of the flooding from happening. At this point, how is that being utilized to help keep some of this from happening? What's being used from the rebuild portion of the city's fund to help change the dynamic about the flooding possibilities?
This is probably the 10,000th meeting I've been asked about rebuild, and it's only because I was one of the architects of the program. I think the issue that we have to recognize with Rebuild Houston is that it's primarily focused on the city's infrastructure and how we are able to deliver water to the county's infrastructure. The problem is that we have residents that believe that the city is not using the money wisely. And I would suggest, as you look back on Rebuild Houston since 2010, the mistake that we made actually two. We passed a revenue stream financing structure without having a definitive plan for the public to see, okay, that's where the money's going. And then what we did internally to the city at the time was we blended the money by doing some accounting procedures, hopefully with the goal of being transparent, and we ended up being just the opposite, because they felt like the city was hiding the money. So with Rebuild, what we're doing now with Rebuild, if you think about it, I got a copy of a report from the Greater Houston Partnership that was dated 2004. And in 2004, the city of Houston was spending $30 million to do storm sewer and street infrastructure improvements when they had a problem that was over $10 billion. What we're doing today with Rebuild Houston, we're spending over $290 million a year. Think about it. That's really what needs to be done. So when people talk about rebuild, and if they want to change a program, that's okay. The program needs to be fixed, but it doesn't need to go away.
We've heard a lot about engineering solutions, things like that. How about land use kinds of controls? One of the, and I want to get to this right now because one of the women, before she leaves, I want to get this question in. It's a very good question, and I would have asked it too. Commercial developers in Houston, should city codes be changed so that commercial developers be required to put in and pay for their own detention ponds and detention basins or ponds within their communities?
Do you want me to start?
Go ahead.
So it is an ongoing debate, both in terms of internally within the city and also with the county and also with the residents, that they believe that our criteria is not stringent enough. And so I've visited with the mayor. We're making a recommendation from my office to do a task force to address that particular question, both not only in terms of detention and grandfathering of detention, but also in fill. You know, we have a lot of challenges in redevelopment, and when we have parcels come in and fill their site that displaces stormwater, that's against state law, that's also against city ordinance, but we don't do a good job of policing that. So those are some of the issues that we hope that the task force will address, and the administration is currently reviewing that.
Can I respond to that a bit? You know, sometimes you look at cities around you and you realize what they're doing, and you look at Fort Bend, which is one of the fastest growing counties in the nation, and they have more stringent detention requirements than the city of Houston does, and I think Harris County does, except in the maybe Cypress Creek. No? Well,
Okay, go ahead.
okay. Anyway, so I guess my point is that sometimes it's just putting in the right guidelines, and people might complain in the beginning, but they generally follow along because developers want consistency, they want fairness, and they want to all have the same rules so that one group isn't benefited over the other. So I just think we ought to look at some of the things that other people are doing, like the Woodlands, and I'll say Fort Bend, at least that's what I was told.
Sure. So one important thing that I'd like to bring up is that we, at least in unincorporated Harris County and at Flood Control District, didn't have a detention policy in effect and starting enforcing it until the mid to late 1980s. At that time, there was already 2.5 million people and associated infrastructure already in place in our region. So if you look at some of the statistics that we've seen, like say from the tax day event of April of almost a year ago, 60% of the homes and structures that flooded were actually outside the 100-year floodplain. Now, there's reasons for that. You know, some areas got more than 100-year rainfall amount. There's other sources of flooding. We talked about sheet flow and from your streets. The other interesting statistic is that 80% of those same structures that flooded were built prior to 1989. And so if you start looking at where the majority of the flooding problems we have are these areas that were developed prior to our really understanding and having good available data related to elevation, what constitutes a 100-year floodplain, and things like that. So when you start looking at new development, everything that's been built prior to the late 1980s, at least in unincorporated Harris County, has been required to do detention. Now, our detention started off only looking at the 1% event. It looked at, that was the criteria. In other words, if you had an undeveloped piece of property, once you developed it, the amount of water you let off that property could be no more than what was undeveloped at the 100-year or 1% event. Since then, we've updated our criteria to include not only the 100-year event, but also the 10-year event. And we also put provisions in there that in the event that the receiving stream that your development outfalls into has less than a 10-year capacity, we've got to detain to that level too. So we're slowly ratcheting down as we have a better understanding and our understanding evolves about how our area reacts to rainfall. We're implementing those criteria and updating our criteria. I mean, it's been our criteria that started in 1984. It's been updated 2 times since then. We're going through another iteration as we speak. So it is an iterative process, and we are making sure that development happens in the right manner and doesn't increase downstream flood risk.
What is the biggest challenge in trying to make sure that there's a balance between what developers can do and the need for the community to continue to be vibrant and growing without putting too many restrictions on some of those developments?
Well, I think in terms of redevelopment, we have challenges with our internal infrastructure. And even when Public Works is doing a project, we're constantly trying to mitigate for our projects internally to the project, which we call structural detention. The challenge that I have with, and also with using Rebuild Houston dollars, is to look for areas where we can jointly work on regional detention facilities. Now, if you look at a map of the city of Houston, we have very little green space. The only green space that might be available to us would be our parks. We have over 300 parks that some of them are used, some of them are not. We have school sites that we might be able to use. So we're trying to be a little bit more creative on where we can put detention rather than increasing the cost of an infrastructure improvement, whether it's servicing the city of Houston's existing residents or whether it's developers. We're also looking at, and don't get me wrong, I'm actually looking at relocating existing landfill sites and converting them into detention facilities. So we're actually thinking outside the box. And I remember when I was with Dr. Bedient the other day, we were at Rice and we were talking about some of this stuff. He said to me, Steve, just go away from that. Go buy some more golf courses. So, and you never know. I actually made a phone call and I actually went over to a president of a local golf course and said, are you interested in buying? And he caught and laughed at me. And I said, well, listen, nobody knows a no unless you ask. And it's all about a business decision.
I think one thing that's really important, though, is that a lot of the people who live here and the people who are moving here really do care about green space. I know when Bill White was mayor, one of the things he talked a lot about is how do we protect more land and how do we use it for multi-use purposes. And the flood control is really good at that, using flood control projects that are also recreational projects, because people don't want to just live on impervious cover. They don't want everything to be paved over. They really want to have a quality of life issue. And I think that there needs to be a balance between using the natural systems that we have that can help us reduce flooding and also doing the kind of engineering projects so that people want to still live here. They don't want to just make money and move.
And we're working right now, my staff and I are working together to develop a pilot project called Gray to Green. I mean, there are a number of cities throughout the country that are doing this. And one would say, well, that's not going to really impact the volume of water. But if you think about it, we really have to start participating on other levels. We need to lead by example. I remember when Sally Alcorn, who's here, she and I are working together on this, and she brought to me a program that San Francisco is doing called Adopt a Drain, which I thought was the dumbest idea I've ever heard of. And it's really, I mean, the city gives a resident a broom and a wristband to sweep up the gutter before it rains. And if you think about it, that is a great idea to get, first of all, the public involved in flood protection, prevention, because what they don't realize, the city spends almost $60 million a year cleaning out storm sewer systems. And if you went out to my neighborhood, which I live inside the Montrose area, I mean, there are leaves everywhere. And if we could just participate on a local level, I mean, it might work.
One of the questions, we're asking your questions now for the remainder of this session. We've heard a lot about engineering solutions. This actually piggybacks on what you were saying. What about land use controls that keep development out of harm's way and preserve coastal areas as natural areas and parks? I bet that's something you'd be really excited about.
Yeah. Actually, I was talking to someone who was talking about the floodplains that were originally here before urbanization, before farming and ranching, and how they really took up more of the land coverage. I think estimates are between 10 and 15%. And while I know, and Russ is definitely right, that a lot of those places that are flooding came in before the regulations, and I know how much it would cost, I am not naive about this, is that if we can keep people out of harm's way, if we can have those floodplains back again, whether it's because you've had a repeated event and somebody buys out your house, because who wants to give up a house if you're going to make nothing on it? That may be your retirement or your legacy for your children. But if you got money and you could move out of being flooded 5 and 6 times, I think most people would do that. And then you use that because you can't build back on it, and you use that land for park space, for trails, those kinds of things. And you can do that, it can be on the coast, but it can be along creeks and bayous, it can be along the Brazos River, San Jacinto, those kinds of things. But we don't really have those kinds of and I'll say the Z word, zoning kinds of requirements here to allow us to do that. So instead, what we need to try to do is to see if we can come up with incentives. And one of the reasons that I thought the Cypress Creek Flood Control Overflow Project was a good one, is that it allowed developers to,
'cause I think most people don't really know what I do. They try to figure out what the resilient officer really does. So instead, what we need to try to do is to see if we can come up with incentives. And one of the reasons that I thought the Cypress Creek Flood Control Overflow Project was a good one, Cypress Creek Overflow Project was a good one, is that it allowed developers to
go over here in this area, which could be developed because over here was going to be saved and protected. And it made a nice balance. And so all of a sudden, you increase maybe 5, 6, I would hope 10,000 acres more in one particular area, and you get to develop over here. So we've used incentives as opposed to disincentives.
Here's, go ahead. Were you gonna?
I don't want to put words in my commissioners' mouths, but from my perspective, some of the nicest parks that the precincts have put together have been on some of our stormwater detention basins that are wet bottom. They were constructed such that they could support aquatic life, such as fish. We plant annually around 20,000 trees per year. Many of these are along the slopes of our detention basins. I mean, these are great gems that in the 95% of the time they're not needed when it starts raining. They're dual use. I mean, go back to increasing quality of life. I mean, they're there to help store excess stormwater when needed, but when not, they're there as a great community asset to provide additional green space. Now, as far as enforcing zoning, I don't have zoning. I can't do that. But what I can do is make sure that development that happens has to happen smartly. And so that was what our criteria is set up to do, and make sure that any new development does not make flooding worse for anybody else.
Yeah, so here's the problem. The city is unique relative to the three of us sitting up here because the city is redeveloping, and there's a push for walkable city, which means densification. And so as we densify in specific areas, we're challenging our existing infrastructure. Most of the areas that are redeveloping are in areas that were built prior to 1984. And so they're in neighborhoods that are prone to flooding because of the fact that the sheet flow within those street systems have nowhere to go. So we have this dual problem of how do we manage development, how do we allow for development to occur. Remember, municipalities are reactive rather than proactive, okay? If we were proactive, the comment would be from the public, well, you're wasting our money, why are you investing over there if there's not a problem over there? Okay, so we're reacting to what's happening right now. And so those are the challenges that we're having. And so you have to have a balance of, do you want to allow for economic development to occur, to densify, to become walkable, and still face with those challenges? Now, people would say in the development community, well, all we're required to do is mitigate our effects, and that's true. But if you're in a flood-prone area, someone would say, well, why aren't you solving the existing flooding problem? Well, one could argue that's the city's problem to do, and the city should be doing that. If we're allowing development to occur in a specific area, we should be doing the mitigation for the existing flooding condition. Now, Russ and I have talked about, well, why don't we ask the developer to participate more? And one might say, well, that could be a form of taking. And so, that might open up the government agencies to lawsuits from just the development community. So there's a balance here. There are questions we still have to answer that we're still focusing on.
We have about 10 minutes, so I want to make sure we get, consider this lightning round responses so we can get as many of these answered as possible. One of the questioners asked, Greens Point flooded, and this is probably more for you, Russ, Greens Point flooded by overland water flow, water that left the bayou upstream. Can you put a berm in critical areas? First of all, is that premise correct? And then can you do that?
Well, the majority of the flooding that we're aware of, I presume they're talking about the tax day event. That was the most recent one. We did see significant flooding along Greens Bayou, just north of 45, just outside the Beltway. Some apartments there were even on the news. And a lot of that flooding, at least from our perspective, was from riverine flooding. Greens Bayou got up out of its banks and flooded that area. The good news is there's a graphic on the screen there, is that Greens Bayou is one of our core projects. We have a partnership with the Corps on this particular watershed. We currently have around $100 million worth of active construction on Greens Bayou right now. Everything from channel improvements to literally almost 4,000 acre feet of stormwater detention basin. That's going to make a huge impact on reducing flood risks through that area. So will it solve everything? No, I'm not going to stay up here and say that, but it will do significant steps to reduce that flood potential.
Question is, how does what happens on the Katy Prairie impact downtown Houston? What's the connection?
Well, the connection is that Cypress Creek flows right straight through us. And so if Cypress Creek overflows its banks, it's got to go somewhere. And we are trying to find a way to actually hold that water back. Now, obviously, it was held back somewhat naturally when the tax day flood because it didn't have any place to go, so it slowed down. But if we could do the Cypress Creek overflow project and put a berm there and some wetlands, now we're not talking about digging a deep hole. That's not the point. It's not going to be a huge excavation project, but it will have wetlands on the inside of the berm, and we'll have restored tall grass prairie. We would be able to hold the water for, sometimes 2 and 3 times as long as we would otherwise, and we'd hold more water. One of the things we're looking at, though, is we need to make sure that that inundation level and the duration of that inundation is not going to actually destroy the restoration work that we're having, because then we keep having to restore it. It will cost too much. So, again, it's a balance. How much water can we hold? And that water flows right into Addicks and Barker. If Addicks and Barker, which, as many of you know, are going to be fixed because they do have some pinch points, some things that are of concern. If there's too much water and they have to open up their gates and let more water flow downstream, you're going to have more damages in the medical center and Memorial Park, those places in downtown Houston.
Flood insurance question. Flood insurance heavily subsidized by the federal government. Rates are rising. What would be the impact of market rates for flood insurance on development in our area?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about that. We don't really get involved in flood insurance rates as a city, but we are a participant in the National Flood Insurance Program. And the National Flood Insurance Program is up for reauthorization right now. And there's a discussion about whether or not we should be charging market rate. There's a discussion about whether or not, if you're out of the floodplain, what rate should you be charging. The challenge that the program has right now is that there are new insurance companies coming in and reaching into the insurers that are out of the floodplain that are paying a reduced rate and offering them a slightly little discount, and they're taking them out of the system entirely. Right. So it's really creating a burden on the actual flood insurance program, which is already, I think it's about $23 billion in the hole. Right. So the program is financially insolvent. It needs to be fixed in terms of everyone paying a fair share. So you're going to see that are people that are outside the floodplain, like myself, are going to pay a lot more than what we're paying now in the future.
Question, is there any research conducted to investigate the adverse effects of the coastal spine on inland flooding during a tropical cyclone? Anything that you're aware of? We've been talking about that a lot. So.
I think we heard Dr. Bedient say that is one aspect that they looked at, and they're assured us it's not a concern, and I'm going to leave it to the experts to confirm that.
I will add, though, that the Conservancy is going to be working, we hope, with the Speed Center on some hydrological issues and some other things, and I don't know it's going to be directly about the spine, but he is looking at the level of inundation and what impact it's going to have farther downstream toward the bay.
One of the questions here now, has the modeling of runoff into the Brays Bayou drainage area taken into account a possible capacity effect, a capacitance effect of the retention ponds that could at times increase the flooding in some neighborhoods? So I'm getting that to mean if the runoff in those areas, if the capacity of the retention ponds may be at times too much and end up flooding in some neighborhoods, say maybe back up or something like that?
I mean, so the project that's in place right now has been closely coordinated and approved by the Corps of Engineers, and it's a combination of almost 22 miles of channel improvements from the mouth of where Brays Bayou empties into Buffalo Bayou all the way up to Fondren, and then out from Highway 6 downstream. There's also a combination of over 10,000 acre-feet of stormwater detention, and those two improvements work in parallel. The detention basins are designed such that they fill up and hold water, again, all by gravity. There's no gates or pumps involved, and then and the channel improvements are there such that we can convey more water into the ship channel and out towards Galveston Bay. But so the beauty there is it all operates by gravity. And the stormwater detention basins work in conjunction with the channel. So once the channel starts receding and has capacity to receive the water from the stormwater detention basin that's holding that stormwater, that's when it starts releasing it.
We hear a lot of names more frequently. We hear Meyerland a lot for flooding, a lot of those kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. What kinds of things are being done in those areas where we most likely, we hear those names more frequently? Sure. What's being done right now that you can say is really going to be making an impact fairly soon to mitigate those issues?
The completion of the Brays Bayou federal project.
Also, and what Russ and I have talked about, when we talk a lot about Brays and the fact that they're going to be removing about 15,000 structures from the floodplain, but there's still going to be slightly less than 2,000 structures remaining in the floodplain, and some of those are going to be in my land. And so what I told the mayor was one of my jobs is to look at, okay, what are we going to do beyond the federal project? And whether it's going to be a joint project or whether it's going to be a city initiative. And so I'm actually looking at the residual floodplain after the project's done and figuring out what we can do there, which is either relocate a landfill site, buy a golf course, look at some other channel improvements to figure out ways that we can help the existing residents. Now, that being said, I don't think there are parts of my land that will not ever be out of the floodplain. But we are looking at the possibility of putting check valves or control structures on the storm sewer systems so that when Brays is up, it's not backing up into the neighborhood. So those are some of the issues that we're looking at right now.
Are we talking 5 years for that sort of thing? What's the completion date of Brays at this point?
Right now, we're hopeful that we can complete the channel work along Brays, which will get us all the way up through Fondren in the next 3 years.
Okay. Question about what strategies can be pursued to reduce injuries and fatalities during flood events? That's one of the questions we have.
Yeah, I mean, from our experience and looking at that, if you look at the number of people that have unfortunately lost their lives in some of the more recent rainfall events, even going all the way back to Tropical Storm Allison, the vast majority of those unfortunate incidents have happened outside of people's homes and businesses. So one of the things that we advise the public on is there's a number of tools, including on our website, everything from floodplains to ponding maps to real-time rainfall data and bayou level data, to make sure you stay in tune and aware of that. Be aware of your surroundings. And if it gets to a point where the streets are started flooding, our advice is to stay where you are and ride it out. People get themselves in the biggest bind when they start venturing out, driving out in these events when the rainfall is really coming down, and that's when they get themselves in the most trouble. So our advice is, if you can afford to park somewhere and ride the storm out, that's our advice.
Yeah, so the city is actually, most people don't notice, but we have over 65 or 66 non-gauged underpasses that are subject to flooding that could have people drown in them. And so one of the programs that we're working on is pursuing a National Science Foundation grant for an early warning system that could be constructed at each one of these facilities. We recruited Dr. Bedient. We've also asked Dr. Brody from Texas Galveston A&M to help us as well with our housing department, and I have yet to talk to Russ to see if Flood Control Districts is interested in getting on that bandwagon to pursue that funding for an updated early warning system.
Absolutely.
I was going to add one thing. Is with the influx of new residents, I think when everybody gets a Texas driver's license, they ought to learn how to not drive in a flood. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of people who go in and don't realize that the underpass is depressed, and then they're stuck, and they either drown or can't get out. And I think if we had a better driver's education program, that would really help. And I know that the marketing that's been done, turn around, don't drown, is found really wonderful. But again, we could do a lot more.
That was the last response. I was going to give you 1 minute, and you took most of that, so
I'm sorry.
you're good with that. Steve Costello, Mary Ann Piacentini, I love saying that. And Russ Poppy, thank you so much. Thank you. Give them all a big round of applause. It's good to hear about all of the communication that's going on and all of the work that's going on together among all of these organizations. Councilmember?
No, they are. Thank you, Cambrell, and thank you everyone again for coming here. I think all of those questions that were asked that may have not been addressed so far in the forum, we want to thank the AIA Houston. AIAHouston.org is where those questions will be listed online, as well as a response. So please look there or contact my office or Dave Martin's office at the City of Houston. We want to thank Cambrell and all of our speakers. And let me throw it to Dave.
Just a quick special thanks to Cambrell, who gives of his time graciously. So thank you, Cambrell. And one thing to take away from tonight's session, that Stephen Costello is not a golfer. You can tell. Good night, everyone.